It's a pleasure to host and introduce Professor Vijay Chandru, who is visiting us from the Indian Institute of Sciences in India. He's here to attend the AAAS meeting as well, as I understand, and we took the opportunity to have him join us as well. As I was telling Vijay, we have the largest contingent per capita of ISC alumni here. So it was only natural that Vijay would visit us. So Vijay has had a long and distinguished career spanning 4 decades in academic and industry. He finished his PhD from MIT in operations research and management science, if I understand the department correctly, and then went on to become a faculty member at Purdue University before returning back to India and joining ISC as a faculty member there. Vijay has done some remarkable work, which I'm sure he will tell you about, but has been elected to the Indian National Academy of Engineers, Indian Academy of Sciences, and also won the President's Medal of Informs. I think the part that is perhaps quite interesting from a career as a faculty member is he and his colleagues are first faculty members who started a startup back in India as faculty members. This is not a common stance in India, at least was not back in 1990s. So they were trailblazers. One of the first companies that I came to know about was Computers, and that did very well, was bought off. And then Vijay and others led the Strand Genomics company, which was recently acquired by Reliance. Vijay actually led it and was CEO till 2018, 2019, if I recall right. And a good piece of news, just today, Reliance announced, really remarkable, that they are going to provide services to sequence the entire genome for individuals in India for about $100. That's a stunning number. We talked about literally millions of dollars for the first human genome, $1,000 discussion, and now they have taken it to the next step. And I really applaud you folks for doing that, because it will open up the market and places like India, which really $1,000 is way too much money in a typical setting. So I think Vijay has also had a tremendous impact in India on academic circles, but maybe I will take the risk of saying that his biggest impact as far as our group is concerned is mentoring and being co-advisor for Anil Volikanti, who is here online. He can't join us today in our room, but Anil has done remarkably well, Vijay, here, and we thank you for mentoring Anil and also continuing to work with him. I think we hope that we have more people like Anil and others here join us. So thank you very much again. I'll pass the dais to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Madhav, and it's really an honor to be visiting here at the Biocomplexity Institute. In many ways, you've been the trailblazers in this whole area of computational epidemiology, and modeling. I almost feel like I'm preaching to the experts here, which is always a little dangerous. But here, what I thought I would go over today is really kind of looking back. Here in 2023, and I think Samarth and I were discussing earlier that maybe it's a great time to sort of look back to what's happened over the pandemic and over the last 4 years, and how we sort of build on that. Right? And so it's more like a story, and I'll take you chronologically through how we saw it in Bangalore as it unfolded and what were the various roles that were played. And of course, there are plenty of roles that the Biocomplexity Institute itself played through many of you here, collaborations in India, and particularly oriented towards managing the pandemic within Bangalore. So, of course, I just want to mention, I think Ramesh Hariharan, by the way, was actually Anil's real guide. I mean, in some sense, we were both co-guides, but they worked very closely together. Of course, Chitra Pattabhiraman, some of you have heard. I think she came on a call early on with the Institute. And of course, Rajesh and Siva are friends of the Biocomplexity Institute. So we've all been sort of working together on things. So just very quickly, for those of you who really don't know about Bangalore, a little bit about Bangalore, and then what is this new excitement about One Health City? And then, as I said, the story, chronologically, and how the various methodologies of modeling, management of the pandemic, testing, genomic surveillance, sero-surveillance, and so on. And finally, how it is now getting more and more into environmental sampling and environmental surveillance through wastewater testing. And then, in some sense, looking forward to what we want to achieve. So, Bangalore is roughly about now about 13.6 million population. It's organized through it's called the Bruhat Bangalore Mahanagara Palike, which is the agency that manages the city of Greater Bangalore. And it's organized into 28 assembly constituencies. So those are the legislators who represent those constituencies, the 243 wards and localities and so forth, right? And of course, it's a big bustling city now with such a large population. The Indian Institute of Science, just for reference, is fairly central. It's built on land that was granted by the Maharaja, so it's right next to the palace. And so it's in a nice central location. We have pretty much good access to the whole city from where we are. Historically, Bangalore actually dates back to, at least the name dates back to the 8th century. It's probably 7th, 8th century was when the city was established. There's, of course, a more popular version about the city name actually coming from Bendakale, so, that the town of boiled beans, but that. So I always used to joke when I was a student in Boston that I come from the other bean town. Right? But it's actually now India's 4th largest city. So it's gone past Madras, Chennai as in population. And of course, there's a fantastic sort of concentration of scientific talent and technology talent in the city. Partly because of the institute where I'm at, the Indian Institute of Science, has been sort of the mother node and sort of the premier research institution. Started in 1909. But then you have a whole host of other institutions now that have come up, many of whom were influenced by the Indian Institute of Science, but now are thriving institutes on their own right. And of course, you have this whole phenomenon since the 1980s, mid-80s, that multinational companies have come to Bangalore and set up R&D there. And at one point, I think General Electric had more patents coming out of their facility in Bangalore than Schenectady. Right? So they had about 3,000 PhDs employed at the Jack Welch Center in Bangalore. So it's really been kind of the tech hub of India. And of course, one of the attractions is that it sits on a plateau. It's about 1,000 meters above sea level. So that makes it cooler and also has good rainfall. So we get, nice gardens and so it's called the Garden City. It's now got the 3rd largest airport in India. It has a capacity of 25 million passengers per year. And of course, it has bad drivers and wicked potholes, just like Boston. So commercially now, Bangalore is also kind of an important city in India. I think roughly about 40% of all the unicorns, so the billion value companies are
in dollars.
Billion dollars. Yeah. And India has about 108 altogether now, and roughly about 40% of those are in Bangalore. So So it's, it's now for fintech or retail, you name it, there's a lot of stuff going on, right? And so the country also looked towards Bangalore as an important city, which could also be effective in trying certain new ideas. So recently, after the pandemic, the national government has declared a national One Health mission. And the principal scientific advisor to the government of India, who's like the chief scientist of the country, has declared that this will be one of the most important missions that he will head. And his role is basically to coordinate between all the different ministries involved. And his office will do that. And one of the cities they've decided that will be kind of the pilot for this program will be Bangalore. And that's called, the project is called One Health City and Bangalore cluster. In fact, late tonight, I will actually attend the launch. It's actually happening tomorrow in Bangalore. And the Indian Institute of Science and many of those institutes are listed are involved. Why Bangalore? Well, I think we've already seen all the reasons, but I'd just like to point out that the fact that in many ways, Bangalore has had a history on the last maybe 20 years or so of what we call vision groups. And the vision groups for various technology initiatives and so on have representation from government, industry, and academia sitting around a table like this and essentially taking decisions jointly and working towards, making initiatives and innovation and so on thrive. And it's probably one of those states that does it better than others. So there's a good chance here that this can actually be adopted across all these institutional stakeholders, right? So let's switch over then to the, in some sense, the story of the pandemic, how it unfolded, and how modeling and other technologies played an important role. And then let's start with modeling. And of course, this cartoon, I don't know if you've seen it. It showed up on Twitter and I kind of pulled it out, but it's basically everyone became an epidemiologist, right? during the pandemic. This time the bookstore is saying epidemiology is now in the self-help section. So the early response in Bangalore was actually at the Indian Institute of Science, and Rajesh Sundaresan started up this effort. And then later, the folks from Mumbai, from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, also got involved. And they basically constructed a synthetic population model of about 13 million agents, so which was roughly the population of Bangalore. And they were able to run these simulations using some of the supercomputing infrastructure that the Institute has, and were able to look at simulations that essentially studied non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, in the context of the epidemic in the early part. So this was all during the early part of the pandemic. And of course, March, April, and so on, we had the initial lockdown. That was a national lockdown. And then there was partial unlocking, which each state had its own sort of policy on, but Bangalore sort of maintained something which we call ward containment. So as soon as a ward started showing certain high incidence of infection, remember there are about 240 wards in the city, the mobility in and out of that ward was restricted. And there was a policy in place for that within this modeling framework, which the city was also adopting. So it was actually a policy that was in practice. so all of this was reflected in the agent model or the city scale model that had been constructed. The model actually showed quite clearly that if there was no intervention, the effects of the pandemic would have been really, overwhelming to the city's healthcare infrastructure. And therefore, there were a lot of questions raised about were all these restrictions really required? And while there are, still some ethical issues of what this did to some of the migrant population who were left stranded when the lockdown happened and so forth. But overall, the healthcare system, the healthcare delivery system was able to get prepared and be responsive. Otherwise, it would have been completely overrun. In some ways, we saw it happening in other parts of the world. And Bangalore kind of, and many parts of India actually avoided that because of the lockdown, right? So this was one clear sort of statement that came out of the modeling effort. And I think that was an important one. By the way, there was a very nice sort of retrospective note that Rajesh and Siva and Gautam Menon put together for the ACM bulletin. And I think this figure is taken from there. So this was the first wave, and this was where the city scale model had been used. And then there was the second wave, which was the Delta wave. And then the third wave, which was the Omicron wave, right? And I think the second wave was something we missed. And there was obviously a lot of consequences to that in terms of misery and mortality and so on. But so while modeling was successful in the first wave, there was a challenge in the second wave. But once the second wave was already in effect, I think towards April, May of 2021.
Sounds about right.
That sounds about right? So this collaboration with the Biocomplexity Institute started, and it led to some strategies to mitigate the resurgence, assuming immunity waning and so on. And so the vaccination strategies were studied. And again, this was a modeling effort. And I think here probably we're not using the city scale models, but more sort of mean field kind of approaches for this.
Just one small clarification. I think we started collaborating with you all.
Right.
I would say after the first couple of months itself.
Right.
And
that's
you were
right.
kind enough to, in fact, invite us to write the first few papers as well.
Right.
But I think it sort of got the shape of a scientific quality work.
Right. Through this. Yeah. So what had happened was that I had committed to the Indian Institute of Science to put together a volume on digital health. And that was scheduled for December of 2020. And so suddenly by April, May, I realized that there was an opportunity to actually talk a lot about the modeling and the scientific approaches to looking at the pandemic itself that was evolving. So try to quickly invite people. In fact, the first paper by Rajesh and others that talked about the city scale work also appeared in that volume, as did a couple of papers from the Biocomplexity. So after the second wave, and we also had this whole modeling exercise to advise the Bangalore authorities and the state government on curfews and restrictions on mobility. And that again came through using mobility data. And I think both Aniruddha and Samarth and I spoke this morning a little bit about this, but it was actually helpful. And there was one point where I think you would see headlines in the newspapers saying that the chief minister has spoken to experts at the Indian Institute of Science and decided that the curfew can continue or be modified somewhat, and it was all based on this modeling effort, which was getting relayed to the technical advisory committee that was overseeing the pandemic. And that technical advisory committee could then talk to the political leadership, and then decisions were being made on this. We were also, unlike the second wave, in the third wave, we were in a position to actually predict it and be able to plan for it. So essentially, the emergence of the Omicron in India was detected back in end of November of 2021, almost 2 or 3 days after the South African authorities announced that they had identified the Omicron. We were able to detect it in Bangalore. So that immediately alerted the local authorities. They didn't announce it for a few days because they didn't want to create panic, but essentially they had time to plan and prepare for what was going to be the third wave. And that was the Omicron wave, as we saw. Very quickly started out with BA.1, but then BA.2 came in very rapidly and essentially wiped off the Delta variants. And so here we start moving now into the genomic surveillance of the city as well. Yeah, and this was, I just wanted, in case any of you had not seen this, the Fifth Communications of the ACM is a nice little review paper that Gautam, who's also an alum of IISc, right? So an IISc connection, Shiva and Rajesh wrote about the whole experience of COVID-19 modeling for India. Genomic surveillance, I couldn't resist adding this little,
I think it's wonderful, actually.
Yeah, it's a little bit of news. I think Chris and Madhav and I were chatting about this last night, and it got announced this morning, and it's sort of been picked up by all the news agencies because it's a $145 genome test. It's actually, it's not a whole genome sequence yet. We expect that those prices will also come down, but this is a broad custom panel that is being designed that will pick up almost all the known genetic predispositions. So it's a preventive health approach. So India now is starting to really get active on the genomics side, and there was both a national consortium of public institution labs under a program called NSSAC, and of course private enterprises like Strand that participated in this. I think the realization at Strand was that in some sense the public agencies and the public labs were not set up to really be able to do this in the kind of time frames that would be useful for decision making. So while they had that capacity to do genome sequencing and even analysis to some extent, by the time they could finish the analysis and give the information to the authorities, there was not much, in terms of actionable value that the authorities were getting. So, and this was, of course, most clear when the Delta variant came in, right? Because what we saw was that there was an acceleration from 0.1% to about 1% in just about a month, right? And so it was going up at a very rapid pace, but somehow this data had not registered. So people didn't really respond to this, or the decision-making agencies didn't respond to this because they were not getting this in time, in real time. If they could get it faster, they could have probably reacted better. In fact, I think Chris mentioned this yesterday as well. There were probably traces which went back to October 20, when the Delta was already around. And one theory is that it went to the UK and then came back to India to actually cause the havoc in 2021. So I just wanted to now talk a little bit about the genomic surveillance. And while we saw that one map, I wanted to point out that there was actually some very early and very elegant work, and I think Chitra talked about this to the group, right? One of those very fortunate coincidences that she had set up a nanopore sequencing lab at the Neurovirology Institute in the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurological Sciences. And she was going to study some viruses that are a problem with various neurological disorders. When the pandemic happened, she was able to quickly become a kind of a poster child for the nanopore guys. And they started giving her all the reagents and the kits that she needed to start working on the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And at that stage, most of the infection that was coming into the city was coming from international travelers. Right? And the city authorities were actually tracking very closely. In fact, they were calling and visiting hotels and places where these international travelers had arrived and were staying. And in fact, I experienced it myself because I had just come back from Europe, and in early March, I was trapped. I mean, basically, people would be calling, the city authorities would be at our house every other day to check if everything was okay. And all the samples were collected, and it so happened that Nimhans was kind of one of the centers where all these samples were sent, because the National Institute of Virology has set up at the institute there. So Chitra was able to actually track not only what variants were coming in, but also how they were spreading across the city, right? And from the city so this is Bangalore and spreading to different parts of the state. And she was actually able to track that, which was fine in the beginning, but it soon started got overwhelming, and they were not able to do the same level of work. And Chitra was getting frustrated, and I had known her since her PhD days. So I suggested that she could move to Strand and set up the genomic surveillance unit there. So that's how Strand got involved. And of course, Strand has a lot of technology at its disposal, and was already quite well versed with SARS-CoV-2, because I think Paragon had developed a panel for the genomic sequencing of SARS-CoV-2, and Strand had been the consultant to actually develop both the assays as well as the sequence analysis on the metagenomic data that was coming out of the panel. So our scientists had already worked on a mutation miner, a text analytics platform using natural language processing to read the literature that was coming out and be able to pick out frequencies of mutations being mentioned in the literature. And so this whole knowledge base had already been developed. And this is one of the strengths of Strand, that it's always been able to track literature and extract important biological information, which it uses in its genomics work and testing and so on. Also, they quickly conjured up a dashboard that the state authorities and the city authorities could use. And then when Chitra moved to Strand, we basically then were set up a process so that within 5 to 7 days of receiving samples, we were able to put things on the dashboard for the city to look at. It could have been compressed a little bit, and in some cases, when the Omicron first appeared and so on, there was a little bit of acceleration, but 5 to 7 days is pretty much what you need because, well, first of all, you have to load up the sequencer. So you needed to get enough samples for that. And then you had to do the sample prep, loading, and then sequencing, and then finally the analytics and the turnaround. Essentially, 2 facilities in the city at Strand and at INSTEM is really part of the National Center for Biological Sciences. And these are being reported to the government. And of course, the Indian Institute of Science was also doing a little bit of that. The interesting thing was this all was supported by philanthropic funding. So the NSSAC, the national consortium, was all funded by the government. But these efforts, which were actually working for the city, were funded mostly by in-COVID support. ACT were both local, and then, of course, Rockefeller Foundation from New York gave a fair amount of funding for this. In fact, the in-COVID support is an interesting group of people. There were young people, many of them of Indian origin, who were working with cryptocurrencies. So they actually collected contributions in cryptocurrencies and actually encashed them and created, I think, close to $600-700 million fund.
Wow.
Right. And they were funding all kinds of work during the pandemic, sending oxygen, and, some of the really essential work, but they also saw the value in supporting things like sequencing, genomic surveillance. So that was pretty useful and a slightly different way of addressing this. And so, of course, Strand, was very active during the third wave, the Omicron wave, and was actually reporting on all the variants and so on that are coming out. In fact, we continue even till today. And just before I left, I got the data for the first half of February, but it's really dropped off, right?
Yeah.
Because people are not testing, and so the actual case counts are look too small. In fact, yeah.
India reported 100 active cases.
And only 100 active cases, and so on, which we know is really, really too small. And of course, I think we already saw this. I just wanted to also put up this particular picture because, you also see that XBB came in.
Yeah.
But it didn't have much of an impact in India, right?
Yeah.
We didn't see hospitalizations go up or any challenges. Because by this point in November of 22, I think everybody was pretty much double vaccinated. Lots of people had been exposed to Omicron. They probably had immunity from infection. And so somehow it didn't really cause the kind of challenges that we saw in China and other parts of the world, China, Japan, and so on. It's important to also realize how quickly this Omicron took over, right? While Delta went from 2% to 10% in a month, I think Omicron went from 2% to 86% in a month. So it was just, the transmissibility was just extraordinarily high. Well, this challenge of people not testing and the caseloads and so on being low, I think was realized actually early in the Omicron wave itself, because you could see that many people were just not testing because I think many people were not being seriously affected. Right? There was mild symptoms and so forth. So various groups started organizing themselves on wastewater epidemiology, and probably the first group to do this was the Swasti Alliance, and there were some public health people involved, Angela Chaudhary and others, and Varsha Sridhar was the molecular biologist who set up the first RT-PCR based testing. She was also sending some samples for sequencing, so they were trying to actually see how, just from wastewater, being able to predict what variants were showing up. And this has been ramped up now in a very big way at the Tata Institute for Genetics and Society in Bangalore, along with the National Center for Biological Sciences. Chitra has set up her own little foundation called IDRF, which is also doing wastewater epidemiology. I think she's been given access to the airport and to a few key, commercial centers and so on, where samples are. Yeah, she's collecting the wastewater samples and testing them. So several of these have now appeared in print. The TIGS and NCBS work has appeared in Lancet, and I think the original Swasti work appeared in Frontiers. So the collection is done across the city at the sewage treatment plants, and there are about, 28 of them or so, I think, across the city. And because this was done in the early part of the Omicron wave, they were actually able to compare the clinical samples versus the wastewater samples on the lineages of the variants. And their observation was that from wastewater, they were actually getting a lot more of subvariants. Also because in the clinical samples, they were selective and were not able to see as much. So there's a lot of biodiversity that they were seeing from the wastewater samples. I think the whole question of the veracity of wastewater testing versus clinical testing, I think to some extent, they were able to address that and show that there was enough matching between the two. And
we're discussing, Vijay, in our genomics meetings. In fact, wastewater is the only real signal left to work with. I mean, the case one, as you point out, is essentially over in all countries.
It's all over. Yeah.
This is the only signal that is
left.
left.
So I think we have to just get better at it and more accurate. And I'll say a little bit more about the wastewater stuff in a minute, about the sensitivity of testing and so on. But just wanted to point out that in late last year, December, early this year, there was this whole question of China is seeing a surge. What should Karnataka and Bangalore be prepared for? Is there a fourth wave coming? And I think we all got involved in that discussion. And we actually gave some answers to the Karnataka government and the technical advisory group on, just first explain to them what the variants involved were, and then essentially put together what the wastewater surveillance was showing, along with what Strand was seeing from sequencing, and pointed out that we could see these variants coming. And there was some neutralization study data that we could share that indicated that perhaps we were going to be okay, and that not to worry too much about these new variants like the XBB, because in some sense this had already been in India and we were not seeing too much of a challenge with that. And as I was saying, the IDRF also had some wastewater data. But if you really look at what the wastewater was saying versus what the actual clinical samples were saying, you could see that there were orders of magnitude difference, because the wastewater was saying there may be something like thousands or even up to 10,000 cases still going on. The caseloads were still in the tens and probably much lower levels. So we still need to resolve some of these differences to understand how good this wastewater signal is. Right? I just wanted to point out that I now have another startup. It just I don't seem to be able to stop. I think this is a new company that is doing CRISPR-based diagnostics. We actually, I think, are going to focus a lot on livestock and livestock diseases and so on, which I think the One Health mission is very focused on. But we also decided to go after the Omicron and actually see. So we actually designed the CRISPR guides in such a way that we could actually differentiate between Omicrons and Wuhan to Delta, right? Just by the signal from the CRISPR guides. And we've just finished our initial study and on sewage samples, and the results are actually quite spectacular. We're actually able to call out the Omicrons, very, this is just a sample of 100, but
the intent is to detect a new variant.
New variants, right.
With very low level of.
And with CRISPR, we could be, it's unlike RT-PCR and so on, it's quite a process to generate a new kit. And here you can just design your guides, you can just synthesize them and test them very quickly. And the beauty of the CRISPR-based detection systems are that these could be really strip-based, they could be on-site, you don't even need a lab, So for environmental testing, this may be the next generation from RT-PCR too. And that's what I think Mammoth Biosciences and Sherlock out of Broad and Mammoth out of Berkeley and others have been sort of working on. And I think the indications are that this is probably quite good. And in a way, it's more sensitive even than the RT-PCR. And it's able to pick up. It doesn't need as much amplification, so it doesn't need the thermocycling. So you can do isothermal amplification using RTA or LAMP-based technologies and actually do it in a very simple little device with lateral flow strips and be able to pick up the signal.
Some kind of microfluidics?
It's microfluidics, yeah. So in fact, that's part of what I've come here to talk to various people at MIT on the microfluidics next week.
I don't know whether you've had a chance to meet, but if you have a time remaining, you should talk to Rebecca and Alan. Try to send an email. But,
sure.
Certainly talk to them because they have a nice DARPA/IARPA project that's going on on microfluidic work. So
that's good. Yeah. No,
I think he's talking to Andrew.
Okay, he would know. Actually, he would also know. But yeah, maybe you can invite Rebecca as well one of the meetings if it's possible. Andrew is good, but I'll tell Andrew to talk about that part. Okay.
So this is just the war room that was put together for the pandemic now is being converted into a One Health decision support site. Something happened here, my camera sort of walked the walls there, but it's actually a straight.
Okay, I thought it's a fancy one.
Fancy one. Right. No, the camera did something, it was taking the picture, but I'd actually gone here with the Rockefeller Foundation guys and I just take the picture. But this is the kind of facility that the city authorities, this actually runs in the PPMP offices. And what they want now is essentially data feeds and, so on. They're also monitoring traffic, they're monitoring congestion in the city and water, flooding, various challenges. So I think the roadmap, the first thing is we need to keep listening to the city authorities so that those conversations are going on. I think during the pandemic, it was very easy to do that because they were looking for help. I think now there are more political pressures on them and so on. But we've kept the door open. And what we've done is we've actually hired people out of the city office so that we have somebody who's very familiar with that office and can go in and get the information pass on information. They've been telling us that, of course, they're worried about dengue, they're worried about rabies in the city, and of course, climate change and flooding is a concern. And I think the whole area of climate change, disasters, evacuation, mobility, I think being looked at through synthetic population based approach is important. And I think Madhav has shared some recent work, looking at optimization with simulation to be able to rationally handle evacuation situations and so on. And then, of course, this work that began this whole idea of coupling models of genomic surveillance and evolving pandemics, which I think Balthasar and others have really sort of led and several people here have been involved, and we've been involved as well a little bit from India. So this is a very important new development, and hopefully, this sort of integrated way of looking at both the genomic surveillance and the dynamics of the infection are coupled together, and to avoid situations like the second, when the variant suddenly mutates, how do you still come up with a strong prediction? Right? And hopefully there's more work there. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So, we'll take questions, but I just want to, it's just amazing how much you've done, Vijay, over time. I remember Vijay's work doing horn cloth satisfied with hookah. I told him at dinner yesterday too. That's how I remember.
Yeah.
And you've moved away from horn cloths in a big way, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's remarkable. Chris, I don't know whether you were here when he announced that Reliance is going to put out a $150 odd testing.
I was listening before he came.
Yeah. So that's remarkable. We just talked about it yesterday. So that's a price point that is stunning. But hopefully you'll get to talk to Andrew and I think Rebecca and Alan as well. There's lots of commonalities, Vijay. But I'll open the floor. Thank you once again. Speaking on group's behalf, it's amazing that you could come here and tell us about the work you've done. The spectrum is just
Yeah, I think we all need to tell these stories, right? Because I think what has happened over the last few years has been remarkable.
Yeah, so you've done a remarkable job. So thank you again. So let's open the floor for questions. Maybe I'll give priority to the folks online, given that they were listening patiently. I hope they are still online and not lost them. But I think Andrew spoke, so I think that's still true.
I'll jump in. I was curious in terms of the development of your various assays and sensor deployment that you've done throughout the pandemic. What was the biggest challenge that you guys faced, either technical or social, in terms of implementation and deployment?
Yeah, I think one of the, for example, an AI-based screening method, right, for COVID. In India, it was in remote locations, very hard to get tests done, but they could get a chest X-ray. So we quickly conjured up something which we call something Setu it was, but it was people could get chest X-rays done, put the X-rays up against a backlit plastic sheet or just a white tablecloth or whatever, and take a photograph and send it on WhatsApp, right? And then there was an AI engine that was built based on UK database of chest X-rays and so on, that could both annotate and call out COVID versus other respiratory issues, right? To look for the ground glass patterns and so on. We were getting about 3,500 hits a day, right? From about 18 different countries, because we had made this completely open, completely free, and put it up at the university. But the problem was that, we could only give suggestion, and the accuracy, according to some of the pulmonologists who looked at the reports and so on was reasonable, but this would not pass muster to actually be accepted as a true sort of clinical screening approach. So what was also realized is that when you train these AI methods and build these models, you actually need local data training sets. Indian lungs are probably been affected by pollution and so on over the years, maybe different types of infections, respiratory illnesses and so on. And so India is sorely lacking in what we might call gold standard data sets for actually developing good clinical sensors. Right? So this is a project that we've just started at the Indian Institute of Science. In fact, Rajesh is also involved, and we're doing it with the Indian Council of Medical Research and creating these gold standard data sets, which would be essentially from various clinical establishments around the country and with annotation and expert curation. And then these would be built up into the data sets so the challenge was, in some sense, just not being able. It was called X-ray Setu. If you could look it up on the web, X-ray Setu, SETU. This particular story will come out. I think, by and large, the overall challenge has been how to build something quickly, but then how do you go through the regulatory process, right? And anything you do on the clinical sensor side. Of course, there was the emergency use authorizations that were happening. I met some guys from the Broad Institute who had developed a CRISPR-based COVID test. But by the time they got it ready, I think the FDA said, we don't need, there's no emergency use anymore. And, you have to just stand in line with all the other diagnostic tests and so on. But I do think we have to find some ways of doing this rapid testing and without, of course, the do no harm part is very important and anything to do with clinical. So, but I think that would be the big challenge. I think reagents, being able to get reagents quickly enough in some of the innovation around the sensors and the assays, I think was a huge challenge in the beginning. For example, I had to actually call Thermo Fisher headquarters in Massachusetts to get the early RT-PCR testing kits when we had to start doing the testing in April of 2020 in our labs. And we managed to get one shipment. And then of course, India actually worked very hard on indigenization. And there was a project called INDX, which again was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So now INDX has actually been able to set up extraordinary sort of manufacturing capacity for RT-PCR kits and so on. In India, they were able to bring down the RT-PCR test costs to roughly about $5. So you could do the test for about 300 to 400 rupees. So that only happened with this ability to indigenize and manufacture locally. So those were some of the issues, and I think there will continue to be challenges. But
Great, thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions from folks online? And then we move to folks here.
I have a lot of questions, Vijay, so for our discussion. But like one thing that you mentioned in the One Health mission is this. Of the four parts that you had in the figure, like there was one on strengthening routine prevention programs, which is something that again, like you alluded to in the latter part, like as COVID fades into like the overall public health mission. Can you speak to like how, like for example, like a lot of the technologies that are being developed, are they part of that mission, or like how is it being approached?
This was it, right?
Yeah.
And you were saying strengthening routine prevention programs, right? So your question, I'm sorry, I was.
No, my question was like, I think a lot of what we talked about was still in the space of outbreak response and pandemic preparedness.
Right.
So I'm trying to understand what's like, is there something happening in that space and like how it's being translated with the knowledge of COVID?
The overall strategy towards preventive health, and this is human health, I think is certainly starting to become a focus of the government in public health outlook, because there's a clear realization that India is not going to be able to afford to have sickness care, so to speak. And so health and wellness and sort of preventive health initiatives are going to have to be important. Now, from a One Health perspective, of course, that is one component of One Health. But I think in terms of ecological, for example, disturbance that is happening, which probably is the part of the challenge of spillover and zoonosis and so on, is, this, I live in front of a lake, Sankey Reservoir, right, which is just on the other side of campus. And there are probably hundreds of fruit trees that are along the bank on the other side of the lake from my house. And every evening I see thousands of bats, at dusk, which will fly over my house as they go to their food search over for the night. And only now some of the ecologists and so on are starting to look at bat droppings in that area. And so the molecular ecologists who were from the National Center for Biological Sciences, like Umar Ramakrishnan and others, are starting to collect all those bat droppings. And also now avian flu is a big challenge. So again, wetlands, but that's reacting to a crisis, I think. But I think if you can actually set up all of these early preventive sort of monitoring systems, I think is where probably there could be some benefit. I think the other is, of course, on the vector-borne disorders. Again, it's so hard, right? Because particularly it is Egypti and so on. Any small puddle, right? they can have larvae. So that how to approach that would be routine preventive care. People have been working on this for decades now, but I think this probably needs to be better implementation. Maybe there are other thoughts here that we can talk about.
I think there's just lots of interesting connections, Vijay, But perhaps maybe we should wrap up, given it's.
I have a question.
Yes, please. You can take it to the last
It's
question.
a different kind of question. I'm intrigued with your command and control center.
Right.
So I actually have a lot of questions. So I'm going to just start at like one end and just not ask so many, but I'll just ask. So at that location, are there actual command functions? Does somebody tell somebody to do something from that location?
Right. Yeah. So, for example,
Is there really? Like what?
No, from the location of some event,
From the command and control
from the center itself.
Are there commands issued? From
Yes.
Control commands.
There are control commands issued.
Who do they go to? Well, first of all, who is there that has the authority to make a command decision?
So the city commissioner is in the building.
He's okay, right? But
Yeah.
does he go? Okay,
So he has representation who are actually sitting in the command control center,
okay, sure.
and
watch.
who can actually send out either emissaries, when they see that there's something happening in the city and they need to respond to it, or
So what would that? So okay, so that's Okay. And so what are the sort of things they tell people to do?
Well, it's still early days, but I think, they've been using this a lot for traffic congestion, for example,
Okay,
in
sure.
the city, right? And so they can essentially involve the local police.
Oh, for traffic congestion, but I mean for
health related.
yeah, for health intervention scenarios where you're using
Right.
a kinetic
So
control.
ambulances, directing ambulances to centers where they get a report that there is.
So you would centralize control of dispatch of ambulances?
Dispatch of ambulances. So it's already quite centralized in India. There's a 108 service. So there's a command and control center. It's already doing that with ambulances. So, it's just a question of connecting them.
So when you make an action like that, I'm truly interested in this because
Right.
this is beyond just these models. I mean, if you can't do something like this, it really.
Exactly. Right.
And we don't. So, I mean, this is like, when you do something like, say, send, I guess, dispatch an ambulance or collection of ambulances or something, is there a place where that changes like on these displays? Is there a data presentation or a model or something that is projecting when the ambulance will get there and where it is now?
I think there's
and what its mission is with the metadata on the object. You can click on it and it tells you that kind of junk. Is that going on?
It's going on to the extent that that's what they'd like to achieve. I don't believe that it's all in place yet, but they have about 40. So it's like a command and control center, say for the space organization or whatever. There are about 40 monitors, and there are.
Well, in that sense, it's the same, but I understand how those command and control centers work.
Right.
I understand what the control orders are out of those things. What I'm trying to get a handle on is how you conceive of this, because it's the right way to think about how to collect this stuff, in my opinion. But I think it's a science in itself, right?
It is.
And I'm just trying to understand what you already have because I want to find out, right? This isn't like, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer cross-examining. It's like, I'm just trying to figure out so how much, that's pretty interesting. So, but at the level of the pandemic, COVID-19, if you were going to issue an order to wear masks, or you don't have to wear masks anymore, you can't go in this store, these apartment blocks are locked down or something.
Correct.
Would that instruction go somewhere and leave from that command and control center to somewhere else, or would it go some other path, like from Congress or something?
No, it was actually things like ward containment, right? Which we talked about during the first block level containment.
Those orders would come from the center.
From the
Where
war
do
room.
would they go to police, or they go to?
Yeah, it was mostly to the
And
police.
so the police, okay.
The police then would barricade all entrances.
And then the police report back,
And
it's somehow.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to find out about this.
yeah, but but you're absolutely right. There's really a lot of science and art to making these command and control centers work, and
Because all that stuff has to be modeled too.
right. Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that I in our own stuff, I don't talk, well, sometimes I say it, but usually I just keep it to myself. But one of the things that when we stick things in these data streams, we normally think of them almost as training sets, but I think we should treat them like data feeds that produce error signals. We should have projections and error signals. We should manage the error signal. In fact, you should focus on the error signal, right? So that's different than, there are error signals in learning, but that's not my point, right? So this is pretty interesting. To even begin to be there, you have to act on the system, and it has to do something, right? And so if it was a distributed action, that would also be interesting. If you manage that, that would be pretty interesting. Military command and control systems, they physically look like that, but they don't act like that.
They don't. Okay.
And fire and roads and trains and pipelines, they look like that, but they don't act like that either, because you can actually close a valve or measure a pressure or something, right? This is very interesting to me that we need to, in my opinion, we need to go in that direction. I think one of the sort of ephemeral things is we make models and we just walk around trying to show somebody our model, and like it's got to be embedded in something.
It has
like
to be
this, right?
I think that's the key, and that's the hope here that the lessons from the.
But it's more than just a bunch of models, right? I mean, on displays, it's like really, it's a lot more. I think.
Yeah,
that's cool. Anyway, I like that center. There's centers around, but they're not really actually. They don't really do command and control.
So actually, the guy who ran the war room during the pandemic he's actually a radiologist by training, but he got into health IT and so we've hired him now to the university, and he's our sort of inside man. So I'm there. Rajesh and I are planning to take our entire class to the war room to. For them to understand that we teach a computational epidemiology class.
Can we audit from here? Can we audit that from here?
Thank you again, Vijay. What a pleasure to have you here. I think you have many more discussions lined up.
Right.
And I hope you come again. This is not your last trip here.
Yeah.
And thank you again, Anil. Thank you for inviting Vijay, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.